Thank you very much for turning up to today's audience. Out of interest, how many people are already sort of playing the role of a software architect? Okay, quite a few. And I'm guessing everyone else would like to understand what it actually means. So I think the word sort of architect has a little bit of a sort of dirty connotation today, in that there's a lot of reasons why people say, oh, I don't really want to be an architect, or I don't want to work with an architect. I actually want to bring back the importance of what architecture means and how the role of an architect is successful in today's world when we talk about collaborative teams, when we talk about agile Scrum or XP-based teams, iterating over things where code ships really rapidly. So I want to talk about how the role is played really successfully in a very different way, and that's the whole idea about architects in modern teams. So a little bit about N26. How many people are a customer? Yay, great. So as you know, we're trying to disrupt the way that traditional banking is done. We think that traditional banking is old, boring, and not very digitally accessible. And so we're trying to really change the way we do this. From a technical perspective, I'm really proud about what the team has actually done. So we have really good continuous delivery pipelines. We do more than 100 deploys a week into production, all very secure, regulated, and well-tested, of course. But I'm not really going to be talking about that. My journey has been sort of focusing on working in agile teams, building technical leaders, and most recently talking about building evolutionary architectures. And in sort of talking about building evolutionary architectures, understanding the role of an architect is really key about how do you sustain systems that are constantly undergoing change, and how do you work with the teams who are constantly making changes to those systems so they can actually sort of play. So we are also hiring, so we're looking for people in Berlin, New York. And if you want to talk to me afterwards, happy to do that. But today we want to go on a bit of a journey together, and I want to outline where we're actually going on this particular journey. So we're going to start off by really trying to articulate, well, what is this thing that we mean by architect? It means different things in different organizations, so let's start off with a nice little definition. I want to sort of talk about the elements of what I think makes a good architect in today's world. We won't look at all of them because we only have 30 minutes, but we'll cover as many as we can. And then I'll talk about perhaps a couple of failure cases of where I see patterns of behavior where architects aren't necessarily exhibiting the sort of ideal case, which leads to these stereotypes of perhaps what we think of as bad architects. And then finally, I want to talk about the well-rounded architect. And this is a really key idea about understanding what it means to be an architect and be balanced in your sort of skills and capabilities. So let's start off by understanding what is an architect. So, for me, the architect is simply a role. So we all have sort of roles. It's not really about a title. And a role is kind of a collection of responsibilities. And this means that when we're actually thinking about something, you have a role that's focused on making sure all these responsibilities actually happen. Now, if we take away this sort of idea of it being a title and think about it as being a role, what's interesting about roles is that roles can be played by different people. So maybe it doesn't actually exist. If all of the responsibilities are being taken care of by the team, so maybe you have typically very strong teams of very senior engineers, as long as all of these things are happening, you may not need an architect because all of these responsibilities are actually happening. In other situations, this is kind of maybe played by several different people. So you have people that are maybe focused on different elements about what it means to be an architect and fulfilling certain responsibilities. What I will say, though, from experience, is that not everyone is yet ready to play the role. So when you actually think about sort of moving away from just writing code and you're starting to think about sort of system architecture, you're thinking about system quality attributes for the cross-functional or non-functional requirements, understanding designing for scalability, security, or performance, or latency. These are things that take experience, and this is where not everyone is yet ready to play it, but people have the capability to deliver that as well. So they just need time to understand and get exposed to this. But, we've kind of maybe explored this role about being responsible for understanding these things. I think in order to understand what an architect is, we also have to sort of explore what is architecture. We don't have a really great industry definition, but we can stand on the shoulders of giants who've come before us. So Grady Boosh, fellow at IBM, he talks about all architecture is design, but not all design is architecture. So this is really interesting, right? Is that, if something is hard to change, that maybe becomes a bit more architecturally significant, and that's how we kind of often talk about it. But if we reduce the cost of change, we make it a reversible kind of choice, it's no longer this architectural element, it's really just a design choice that we can change later. And that's something that's really key to think about in today's kind of fluid world of evolving software, is really thinking about how do you make decisions reversible such that they're less architecturally significant and just simply become reversible design decisions. So key understanding here is architecture is really this spectrum of understanding decisions and the impact of how hard it is to change these, where some things are very hard to change, and they are the architecture decisions, and then you have design decisions at the other side where everyone is constantly taking part. So leading on to this, Grady also talks about how it's these significant design decisions, and it's often measured in terms of costs of change. So as an example, one of the really difficult things with sort of legacy systems over time is that you often have lots of instances of these types of things, and that's a different type of cost of change. So even a design decision over time may become architecturally significant because it's the pattern of implementation you choose to have all across the code base. And then trying to change that becomes more significant. And it's really thinking about how do you evolve these decisions over time. So if that's kind of our basis for architecture, let's explore the role between an architecture and an architect. In a lot of places, people think that an architect is really this person who decides on architecture. I make all the really tough decisions is often an interpretation of that. What I've seen really successful architects do is really take this and think about this responsible for. So what's interesting in today's world is that we have really bright engineers working around us, constantly solving problems, constantly learning. And so everyone can actually make decisions. The point is that architect is there to make sure that the decisions that everyone is making are good decisions. So it's this responsibility which is really key. A good mental model shift is moving away from this idea that an architect is the person who owns the architecture. And I like to use the metaphor of this thing about an architect nurturing architecture. So if you imagine a really nice designed garden of some sort, a gardener is not the person who's looking after every single plant, pruning every single leaf. They really start to think about the architecture and the pathways to allow parts of the ecosystem to evolve. And things in nature don't always go to plan, neither do they in software. And so you always have to be able to take on feedback about what the ecosystem is, and you have to adapt to that. And that's the idea of an architecture is nurturing architecture. It's not a one-off activity you do at the very beginning, and then you assume that everything runs perfectly. But you have to actually guide and actually take care of architecture as an explicit activity as your systems and ecosystems actually evolve. So we've explored a little bit about what an architect is and the relationship between architecture. Let's talk about the elements that I think make a very successful architect. So we'll go through only 3 of the 6 that I talk about, but we'll cover all 6 very briefly. The first one that I talk about is often an architect is a great leader. And this is perhaps going on to the whole thing about why I really emphasize technical leadership skills, is that for an architect to help encourage and make sure that people feel responsible, you have to lead people. And that's very different from simply telling people what to do and being this person of authority. Now, what happens if you don't have technical leadership? And perhaps you can actually think about some systems. In a particular case of example, 5 persistence frameworks might appear in a project. You might have 3 automated test frameworks, 5 parallel branches of which there's constant sort of integrating, and maybe a hand-rolled source control system. And this was actually from a sort of client when I was doing consulting, and this was all in the same sort of project. And this often happens because there is no technical stewardship and leadership around this, is that people go in different ways of what they think is actually important. And so if you don't think this happens in real life, this tweet really summarizes it from Julian Boot. Had 10 guys on my last project, all of them had opinions, and all of them were expressed in the code base. How many of you have been in a place like this? You go to that part of the code base and you know exactly who wrote that because it smells of exactly their style. And this is a good example of where a lack of technical leadership has a big impact because it makes change harder. So if you go to one part of the code base, you have to understand how somebody has designed it, their style, before you even start to think about how you evolve and make that change. A good way about visualizing this is that we all work, if we're working in the same service or system, on the same team. So we have a whole bunch of dots that represent people, and you have this goal where you'd like people to go to. Now, when we actually start off on systems, we assume that people are actually heading towards the same direction. But in reality, people are starting to head off in a different direction. Somebody goes, this is my chance to try React. Another person is thinking, this is my chance to refactor this ugly part of the code base. And this other person is like, I just want to get on with the task that I actually want to do and ship some feature to our users. So leadership is a really tough topic in sort of software, and it's a topic that I really am passionate about. And what I kind of think about mental model-wise is avoiding this situation and encourage technical leaders and architects to think about what are they doing to sort of channel people and move in the same direction. So what are the small nudges that you do over time to make sure that people understand the goal? And the goal will change over time, and this stewardship of this sort of team. So an effective architect acts as a good leader and shepherds everyone in the same direction. And this is exactly one of the skill sets that I think makes an effective architect in today's world of modern teams. So the second sort of element is really about this thing about being a developer. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail around this, but the point about architects is that it's very hard to understand what's going on if you don't understand the implications of those decisions. And this is where I'd encourage architects to make sure they read code, they spend time with teams, and there's a whole bunch of reasons I won't cover as part of this talk. The next element I do want to delve into is this idea about systems focus. So at N26, we often talk about hiring software engineers rather than programmers. Why? Because we want engineers to think about more than just the code that they write. They need to think about broader, about the tests and the quality of the code. They need to think about the configuration, the deployment, the security elements. And this is the idea about being systems focused. So an effective architect really thinks about systems. So if we actually think about building systems instead of software, this is kind of the mental model we need to encourage in the team and cultivate a systems thinking approach to building software. So if you think about perhaps code, you often think about, okay, it'll just work in production. But of course, you know that when you launch stuff into production, those environments are often quite different from your local development environment. And one of the key elements is creating a short feedback cycle so that people understand what that production environment is like. Perhaps you actually have physical hardware, but a lot of places in today's world are about maybe shifting things to the cloud. And there are different constraints and behaviors with cloud-based computing than you do with physical hardware. So you can spin up new instances much more rapidly, you can automate those things a lot more efficiently than you can with physical sort of servers. And that changes some of the coding patterns. So the 12-factor app is a really good example about how understanding your environment changes your architectural designs so that you're more effective in that space of your sort of whole system. But code doesn't just run on servers, and that's the only environment. We have to think about the whole ecosystem as well around this. And we have to think about how do we enable software to thrive that we can evolve this over time. So let's talk about some specifics. So one of them is really about deployments. So there's many times where you're actually working, you're writing code on your own sort of laptop, and then you deploy it into a new environment, and then realized, oh, I've hard-coded some sort of environmental configuration that's very different in the new environment. And these sort of feedback loops are really key things when you're actually thinking about systems, about what is it that is different in different environments, such that you can support software that is more configurable. So if you've gone down the path of designing for continuous delivery, you start to understand that the software you build for that is quite different from a sort of application you might push into production once every 6 months. We also need to think about monitoring. So there's a whole thing about observability in today's world, is that we really want to architect for sort of quick response. And this is often a thing that people don't think about. One of the great practices I encourage with our developers is that they really have to do some production support. Because if they don't, they'll start to realize those logging statements are really important, and not just logging everything, but logging really useful information. Perhaps rather than waiting for logs, we should put in alerting so that we know before users about problems that might start to escalate, and then we can actually take action. And these are elements you really need to design very early on to make systems and not just software. We also need to think about fixes, and how do we make sure that we actually get fixes into production really rapidly. So when I was doing a lot of consulting, you'd have people who would sort of push fixes by sort of bypassing a lot of quality processes. So it's like this bimodal IT kind of example of two different speeds. In reality, what you really want to be thinking about is going through the same continuous delivery process as everything, but you want that process to be optimized for speed. So making sure that your pipeline is going through tests really rapidly, you reduce test suite times, and you try to improve the time so you both have speed and you have quality, and both are completely possible. If you follow the State of DevOps report, Jez Humble, so one of the authors of Continuous Delivery, talks about the research that backs this, is that if you optimize for speed, you often have better quality as well as speed in this kind of example. And of course, we need to actually be thinking about constant change as well. So one of the difficulties about our sort of world of software is it's soft. It constantly changes. We can't predict what our users want. And then often when we release something, business users will change their mind about what they'd like again. So we need to really think about patterns that allow us to not overly abstract things away that make change difficult, but such that we can evolve things rapidly and give us safeguards around that. So, if we think about software instead of systems instead of software, it changes the way you actually think. So that's the third element of what it means to be a sort of good architect. The next element is really about entrepreneurship. So architects should really think about the value that they add. So we don't do one architectural tool for the sake of it because it's like fun. We do it because it adds value and it solves problems for us. But I do want to sort of go into also the idea of being an effective communicator. So this is the deeper dive element that I think makes big sense for a lot of architects, and it's not something that we're trained to do. It's not a skill that you're valued in when you're working as an engineer, but it is what differentiates good architects from not so good architects. So as an example, the world in which we live in, often working with technical teams, is we'll use terms like refactoring, coupling, cohesion, Docker. We might talk about Kotlin, continuous delivery, or DevOps. And everyone in a technical world, hopefully, understands what those terms mean. But if you start to use the same language and you're starting to talk to product people, finance people, management and marketing, the often big response you'll get is a whole bunch of puzzled looks, and they have no idea what you're actually talking about. So there's a big skill in being able to adapt technical terms and project them in words that other people from other departments can really understand. So as an example, you might think about reach and differentiation if you're talking to people from a marketing perspective. You might talk about cost, benefit, and investment when you're talking to sort of finance people about the choice of new tools, about what benefits you might get from it, and the reduction in sort of cost. If you talk to sort of product people, you might talk about risk, return, and opportunity. And so these are words that you add to your vocabulary and you learn how to adapt some of the technical world into more of a non-technical way, such that you bridge this communication gap. I also like to think about that there's different focuses on how you should be communicating both inwards and outwards. Our sort of experience of working as developers as we move onto the path of being an architect often means that we're naturally inwards facing, so we often talk to other technical people, but actually a big part of sort of architect is making sure that other people in the business understand why the technical team is doing the work that they're doing. So there's a lot of sort of outward projection as well about the value in investing in architectural qualities as well. So, making sure that you have regular emails that let people know what is being going on in the sort of technical world, what technical debt is being addressed, and what value it's adding to other people. You might use diagrams, and I'm not talking about lots and lots of diagrams, but I also feel we kind of have sort of thrown out a lot of diagrams because of the whole UML movement. But there is a lot of value in expressing things in a very simple sort of way that communicates a lot of ideas. They often still need a lot of sort of text and explanation around it, but it can definitely help. Think about presentations like this that help people understand a story. And if you don't want to have a presentation, think about an info deck that you can send that has a lot more text that people can read, and it reads like a self-driven presentation. So that's the sixth element. I kind of skipped over the strategic technologist. And the fifth element that I skipped was actually about thinking about what else is coming up in the industry. So, we've made a shift as an industry away from more bare metal building hardware ourselves to more cloud computing. There are trends that often keep changing, and we have to keep ahead of what's actually happening in order for us to understand the practices that suit that new environment and that we can continually adapt our sort of technology as well. So they're the six elements, and I want to quickly talk about a couple of different failure modes that we can actually fall into. So if we think about if somebody has these elements and they focus only on certain elements. So if we have somebody who is a very good communicator and is very outward-looking, but is not so good at a lot of the other elements, the sort of template that I call this one is pretty much the dodgy salesperson. So this is a person that comes to conferences like this and then goes back and tells everyone, this is exactly what we need to adopt. This is going to be the next big thing, without understanding the problems that it's going to solve, without understanding how that actually manifests within the team itself. So these are the big ideas people that like to convince people and wow people, but often the reality is a little bit out of order. And this means that ideas never get fully realized. So you might start down this path, but they kind of fizzle off because they're not actually practical in solving problems. I often call it resume-driven development. We do this thing so I can actually have it on my resume and maybe move on and unfortunately leave a lot of problems. The next sort of anti-pattern is maybe somebody who's a very good communicator and a very good leader. And this is the pattern that I call the ivory tower architect. Now, many of you probably know about these sorts of people, in that these are the ones that have unimplementable designs. So this is the thing that we're going to be going towards. What do you think? And it sounds better in theory than in practice, so that diagram is well polished, but nobody understands how it's actually implementable. And this is often driven through a fear of being redundant. So as we move away from code, we get a little bit less uncomfortable, and we start to make up for that by making decisions out of the blue without a lot of context. So avoid this anti-pattern if you can. But the reason I talk about those failure modes is that these are all traps that we can all fall into if we're not really being focused on being well-rounded, and that's the whole point of this talk, is that when we actually are thinking about these elements, engineers are kind of at this level here where, if they haven't had a lot of experience, they haven't yet got a lot of stuff to be an architect. But there is no right shape for being an architect. So everyone will have different strengths. So some people will be better in one element or another. But the point is that you need to have some basis for this. So you need to make sure that you have some elements, and there is a minimum skill set in these 6 elements to be an effective architect. Now, every architect will have their different strengths, and the question is, how do you go about developing yourself as part of this? So everyone will have this different shape. My recommendation for you is really to think about these axes as a kind of scale, and then you actually project yourself against the sort of scale for each of these elements and do some sort of self-rating. So the way that I often describe these ratings is, you're just starting out in this element. So maybe you haven't really done anything around communication skills. You'd like to get better at that. And so you start taking a deliberate focus on improving yourself. You read books, you read articles, you practice, you put yourself out there and you do deliberate practice to get better at some of this stuff. And then you might get to a level where you're actually capable, and that's really great. Some of you might get to even further, where you become well-known in your company. People come to you for advice about this element because they respect you for the qualities you bring. And then some of you might even be an industry leader, where you publish a book around this topic, and you sort of push the field of software architecture even further. And you don't have to get there, and that's okay. The key here is really thinking about where you are and mapping yourself out and starting to think about what your shape is in today's world. My recommendation would be to focus on 2 to 3 elements in the next sort of 6 months. We all have day jobs and lots of things to do. But if you pick 2 or 3 elements and you focus on those things and make a plan on how you get better of that, you might then come up with an action plan to develop yourself while you're still doing things with your job. And then after 6 months, you review again, and hopefully you're in a bit of a different shape, and then you can repeat this exercise. So I hope you have a better sense of what it means to be a good architect, and what's more important is being really this well-rounded architect. And it's really key that you think about that system architecture is an important element in today's world. It may be distributed in your team, but there is somebody who needs to nurture and make sure that the architecture is being built with the right things in mind. And I hope that you have a better understanding about what it means to be the well-rounded architect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. So, due to excellent presenting skills and excellent planning, we really do have 5 minutes for questions. Now, I'm very suspicious of the user whose username in Slido is N26 is awesome, but...
Not me.
Can you take us through a brief architecture of the N26 platform?
It's going to take a lot longer than 5 minutes.
I'll get a whiteboard. You get the pizzas.
So that's something that I need to have a different talk about, but it will take a lot longer. I can talk about a little bit about what we have. So we have a microservices-based architecture. We're cloud-based. We have a lot of infrastructure as code. And what we're trying to focus on is really cross-functional teams around domain areas, such that people can evolve parts of our product and we can iterate. So that's one of the ways that we get to 100 deploys a week, is that we have smaller parts of our system working on this.
Fair enough. I don't understand the end of this question, but how can architects make software decisions by just playing around with frameworks and libraries? I guess this is a worst practices question. If an architect is just playing around with stuff and then throwing it in there,
Yep.
what sort of stuff happens?
Yeah, so one of the elements I didn't get to dive into is this idea about spending time with code with the team. It's really key. So, I think the idea of playing around with frameworks and libraries is a bit more of this sort of strategic thing about, seeing what this new tool is out there and seeing how it reacts. But what is often missing is just the context about the everyday life of what a service and the problems that a service has. And so this is where the difference is where that's okay to do spikes of experimentation within the context of a service or an application, because you need to understand also the migration path, the difficulties you'll have migrating to this particular tool or library. And I think that's the biggest thing where it's out of context. And that's where spending time with the code, with teams, and sort of playing around with those tools and frameworks within the context of a service is really key. So making sure that you don't just write code externally, but you do it within the context of the service as an application.
While remaining completely positive, okay, chicken and egg question, do bad teams make bad architects, or do bad architects make bad teams?
Both.
It depends.
So consultant answer, right? 14 years of consulting. But I think it really does depend. And so I'm a big systems theory person, so you start to look at loops and understand that. And sometimes a bad team might put somebody who's not yet ready to play this role of an architect into a role where they're overstretched and we don't give them that support. And that can lead to the sort of bad architect from a bad team. At the same time, if you have a highly functioning team, somebody gets elevated into this role of an architect, and they also don't understand what it means to be a good leader, they can often sort of disempower engineers. And I've worked in teams like this where you have somebody telling you something to do, and you're like, I don't really understand why this helps us and how it solves these problems. And that can turn into a bad team as well. So I would actually say both examples are possible. But the point of this talk is hopefully to help people understand, as people move into an architect role, what are the elements that make people more effective. And I also think, once again, you can turn a bad team around with a really strong architect if you can bring up like good technical leadership and you empower that team again.
So what do you think of Simon Sinek's concepts about great leadership?
Yeah, super powerful. So Simon Sinek has really great talks about what it means to be a really good leader.
Right.
Leaders eat last.
Yeah. There's also a concept in, for example, the military where if you have been working with a group of people at a certain level and you get a promotion, they automatically put you somewhere else, like in a different geographical location at your new level. So it's not like all of a sudden you're the big boss of your old colleagues and they think, why did he get it and why didn't I? And so there's so much just packed into that concept, right?
Absolutely.
It's really dangerous waters. I want to know who did your slides.
So I have a wonderful design team at N26. I also did a little bit of it myself.
Okay.
So if you want the icons, we use the Noun project quite a lot.
Okay, well, it's a clue every time you see like a perfect graph that has a perfect scale that turns into the reference for the next slide, and then it's like, oh man, I wish I had time to do that. How would you, continuing on the leadership front, how would you take the dodgy salesperson type and help them grow into what they could be?
So I run a technical leadership program in sort of N26. It's something that I've carried over from when I was working at ThoughtWorks. And I think one of the things is I'm a really big believer in sort of constant feedback. So feedback for me is about helping people grow and be more effective. And this is where, you have to be clear about your expectations from the role, but also try to give feedback about where there are mismatches of how people are performing in relation to that role. So I know this because I've seen a lot of engineers go through this where they get thrown into the architect role, nobody tells them what to do, and then they have to kind of figure it out. And it's often a byproduct of the system not supporting them going into that. So it's not that this person wants to be the dodgy salesperson, as that often it's they don't understand the impact that they're having. And it's really key for organizations to support people in this role to make sure that they understand that. And if they're starting to drift too closely to one of our sort of anti-patterns, is that somebody is giving them feedback about areas that they really need to improve. So, as an example, over time it's very easy to drift away from code. And so, I encourage architects to go spend a week with the team, go write code, go do pull request reviews with them, and make sure that they understand what the up-to-date state of the system is, because it constantly changes. And it's a value that we need to encourage in organizations.
So what if you have larger teams where you might have a project manager and a product owner, and then an architect, and then all these different authority roles kind of moving at each other? How should one deal with that situation?
So if you've been in a leadership position, you know that people are always difficult. So there's no magic combination, right? You can't program people like you can a computer. And that's the thing where I think about how you create the environment such that people can have clarity. And so often when you have all these people sort of trying to sort of lead, it's often useful to have sort of a roles and responsibilities session around explicitly where people have focus. So at N26, for instance, that we have clear responsibilities for the product owner to be really thinking about sort of the market, the user fit, and understanding the clarity of what the user problem is, and also the sort of roadmap of things that they'd like to have. Technical leads are what we call currently sort of product architects. They're really focused on sort of system qualities, right? So making sure that everyone's refactoring really well, that there's good levels of automated tests, that we think about security and threat modeling, that we design for scalability, short latency, and all these kind of characteristics. And then I'm actually introducing an engineering manager as well role, which is the first for our organization as we grow, to also support people. So, I think this is the thing, is that I want people to have the constant feedback at all levels to help people grow. And I also think it's quite a different skill to focus on how you build a high-performing team, that often in the sort of rush of getting everything else done, it sort of gets forgotten about. And so I'm introducing a new role, but we're having a very clear sort of roles and responsibilities, expectation setting.
So some separation of concerns combined with clearly defined responsibilities and areas and interaction models.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That sounds really healthy. Let us know how that works out. I think we're well enough into the break right now. Thanks again. It was so very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.